introduce in a moment. As you will see from the announcement that has just popped onto your screen, we will be recording this session. We've gotten a notice from some folks who wanted to attend but weren't able to do so at this time. So we're going to be recording the presentations so that they'll be able to watch them at a later time. So before I introduce Anjan and turn things over to him in a moment, I just want to take a minute or two to explain what our schedule is for the next 90 minutes. So we will, so please, during that time, if you would continue to keep your microphones muted, I'll try to keep my microphone unmuted when I'm trying to speak. And I want to encourage each of the speakers to do the same. But for the audience members, if you would please keep your microphones muted, that will make sure that we don't have background noise that interferes with the presentations. But also, we encourage you to keep your cameras on. In a minute, we will get started, and here's the way we will work. Anjan will give a brief introduction to the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics, which he directs, and then he will introduce two speakers, two new postdocs who have just joined the center. They will each have 10 minutes to give a presentation, and we'll have about 5 minutes for questions or comments directly after that. If you have a question or comment, please put that in the chat, and Anjan will field those and pass them along to the presenters. At that time, I will give, after the two Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics presenters have given their talks, I will give a brief introduction to the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project and introduce two postdocs who will be presenting from our project. Similarly, they will each have 10 minutes to present with 5 minutes of Q&A after each presentation. And we encourage you to chime in via chat if you have questions or comments for each of them. At that point, we should have some time for a general discussion among the speakers on the topics presented, the overlaps between them, and so forth. So again, if you have comments or questions at that point, please add them to the chat, and Anjan and I will facilitate that. And again, we plan to finish by 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So at this point, again, I want to welcome each of you zooming in from wherever it is that you are. There are disadvantages and advantages to this, the ways in which we must connect these days. It would be nice to see your physical selves, although I'm mindful that if we had that requirement, many of your physical selves would not be able to attend. So we appreciate you being here. Okay, so at this point, I will turn things over to Anjan Chatterjee. Anjan is the Elliott Professor of Neurology, Psychology, and Architecture, and the founding director of the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics at the University of Pennsylvania. Anjan and I have been collaborating for, I don't know, 2-3 years now, something like that, having very rich discussions about connections between the work that he's doing at the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics and our work at the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. So Anjan, welcome, and I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, James. It's really a delight. James and I have been talking about doing something in a more public setting for quite some time, and this is finally coming to be. I just want to make one minor correction to what James said. I am no longer the Elliott Professor. That endowed chair came with being the chair of neurology at Pennsylvania Hospital, which I gave up in order to direct the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics. But everything else you said is accurate. And just to give you a sense, our goal is really to try to advance the basic science of our understanding of the biologic basis of aesthetic experiences. That's the fundamental goal. We approach this through vision. One can approach it through any sensory modality, but we think of aesthetics broadly in the context of people, places, and things, which is how the visual system carves out the world. And so we're interested in aesthetic experiences of people, of our environment, and objects, which can be the design of objects or the quintessential aesthetic object people often think of as art. So broadly, that's our mandate. but we're also interested in community building, and that has to do with other groups on Penn's campus, like James's group, but also outside Penn as well. We've had, for example, someone who spent their sabbatical year here. Across the world, there are relatively few places that focus on aesthetic experiences. And I think it's incumbent on those of us who care about this to find each other as part of a general community building enterprise. I will also make one announcement, which I think this is the first public announcement I'm making of this, which is 2 years from now, 2022, in early September, we will be hosting the International Association of Empirical Aesthetics meeting. And we will be doing this in along with the Barnes Foundation. It turns out it's the centenary of the Barnes Foundation. For those of you who don't maybe know who the Barnes Foundation is, a very well-regarded, one of the most extraordinary private art collections in Philadelphia. Dr. Barnes, who was a physician who was actually trained at Penn, was always very interested in the way science interacts with art. And so the people at the Barnes Foundation feel like if he were alive now, he would be very interested in neuroaesthetics. And so 2 years from now, early September, for those of you who are interested in empirical aesthetics, the major international meeting will be here. Okay, so moving on, because you're not here, you haven't signed on to hear me talk. I'm going to introduce our new postdocs. What this means is that the work they're going to present is what they did before coming here. This is not work they've done in the center, but it also gives you maybe a kind of a sense of the sorts of people we look for that bring sort of skills and knowledge that is useful and synergistic when it comes to questions of aesthetics. So, and as James mentioned, they will be speaking for 10 minutes. And for trainees and senior people as well, you should know 10 minutes is a really hard talk to give because you've got to get it. You don't want to be vapid. I'm setting them up, which I don't want to make them even more nervous, but you don't want to be vapid, and at the same time, you don't have that much time. So we're going to start with Alex Christensen, who got his degree from the University of North Carolina. He worked with Paul Sylvia, who some of you may know if you are in the world of aesthetics. Paul has done a lot of work on some work on quantitative methods, but also on personalities, differences, and what predisposes people to be engaged with aesthetics and so on. Alex has special expertise in quantitative methods, which will relate to what he's going to talk about. But to give this a little more texture, whenever we're talking about aesthetic experiences or people's personalities and predispositions and even the brain, we're really talking about multidimensional factors, right? These are not simple one factor, one outcome kind of research enterprises. And whenever you're dealing with something that has that level of complexity, the question always is, how do you deal with complicated data? How do you reduce it without simplifying it in a way that's manageable? And so, most of the people in the audience will know of tried and true methods like principal components analysis and the way in which you take large data sets and try to get some purchase on it. And Alex has been at the forefront of developing a slightly different way of approaching this, which is sometimes referred to semantic network analysis or just network science. And with that brief introduction, let me turn it over to you, Alex.
Well, thank you, Anjan. I really couldn't say it better myself. I think that's a perfect introduction and sets me up very well here. So with that, I'll get my screen share going and hopefully you all can see the screen I have there. So to start, thank you all for joining us virtually, and for those of you joining us perhaps later with the recording. I appreciate everyone coming in and welcome. I'm happy to kick things off here. So as Anjan said, I'm going to be introducing kind of a new way to estimate factors or estimate summaries, basically, of large sets of variables into more specific phenomena that we're interested in. So very basically, we do factor analysis, or we do principal components analysis, because we want to summarize and explain the pattern of associations between variables. And the reason we do this is because we want to determine scales or the multifaceted nature of the thing we're studying. It's also to derive scores of an instrument. And then finally, it's also to help inform psychological theory. And a lot of examples are in personality and intelligence, but as Anjan had mentioned, it's also in aesthetic experiences. And so really over the last century, principal components analysis, which I'll just call PCA, and factor analysis, which I'll probably refer to as FA at some point during the talk here, these have really dominated the field really for about 100 years at this point. And simulation studies have kind of shown that PCA works better for unidimensional estimation or just one factor estimation, whereas factor analysis kind of works better for multidimensional or many factor estimation. And that these methods also tend to be better with continuous data versus polytomous data. And polytomous data is going to be like your 5-point Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So in about the last decade here, there's been kind of a new arrival of network analysis, which, to kind of break it down very simply, network analysis looks at variables or items in a scale as nodes, which are represented by these circles. And then the correlations or the associations between these variables are represented as edges, or these lines going between nodes. And as you can see here, this is a pretty basic and straightforward representation of a network, but these networks quickly get very complex. And this figure that I have on the right of your screen here is actually a network of the World Wide Web. So it's obviously hard to tell or see, but the nodes here represent hyperlinks or links to websites, and all of that colorfulness represents kind of the edges going between those websites. So with network analysis, we're actually able to estimate factors. And with this example here, I've nicely arranged a Big Five factor scale for the Big Five personality traits. And you can see that they arrange quite nicely into their kind of color-coded traits. Like red is agreeableness here, yellow is conscientiousness. And what networks do very well is they kind of present this information, not just between the variables, but also the factors very neatly. And so one thing that we want to do, or one thing that we're able to do with these networks is we're able to estimate these clusters. And these clusters often will have stronger correlations going between them. So if we look at this network plot, the thicker the lines going between the nodes or the items here, the more associated those items are. And so to pick up on these clusters in the network, we use what are called community detection algorithms. And what these effectively try to do is maximize the connections within clusters and minimize the connections between clusters. And this actually really connects nicely with what Adam's going to be talking about with modularity. These community detection algorithms are effectively what can help compute modularity. And so some of the advantages, hopefully, that are somewhat apparent with this network figure is that connections between variables are visible. This is something that you don't really get with PCA or factor analysis. Variables are deterministically allocated into these factors. So that means that these algorithms actually decide which items go in which factor. So you're not doing that yourself. The algorithms actually do that. For people a little bit more familiar with factor analysis, rotations are not needed. And these are typically used to ensure that there are correlations between factors. So this is just removing 1 degree of freedom, or researcher degree of freedom. And then finally, simulation studies have demonstrated as equivalent performance or better performance using these network methods than these more traditional methods. So previous research comparing some of these community detection algorithms have really sparsely been applied. So in the psychological literature, there's been the spin glass algorithm and the walk trap algorithm. I'm not going to get into these algorithms too much, but just know that there are multiple algorithms out there, and really only a few have been used. And probably the closest thing to actually like psychological factors in the literature are going to be comparing these algorithms with brain networks. And from these simulation studies, there's been 2 that have been kind of recommended, the Louvain algorithm and the walk trap algorithm. And in psychological factor data, in terms of simulation studies, only the walk trap algorithm has been used in those studies. So that brings us to the goal of the present research, and that's to examine several of these algorithms in the iGraph package, which are all freely available in R. And the goals are twofold. One is to compare the accuracy in estimating the number of factors in psychological data, and the other is to compare their precision in placing items in the correct dimensions. Because if you remember, these algorithms actually place these items into the factors themselves. So here are the 8 community detection algorithms that were used in the simulation study. Again, I'm not going to go into these in too much detail, but just know that there are many different algorithms out there, and the goal of this is just to see which ones work best for identifying factors in networks. And here's the simulation design. Again, not going to go too deep into the design here. Basically, we varied kind of every component of a typical factor model that we possibly could. Some key points here are looking at such things like sample sizes. We used a really small, or what is actually probably a typical sample size in the psychological literature, as well as looking at continuous and polytomous data, like the 5-point Likert scale here. And for the analyses here, of course, we wanted to have a benchmark comparison with these traditional factor finding analyses. So we used parallel analysis with principal components and factor analysis. And then the statistics that we used to actually quantify the performance here was the % correct, or just the number of correctly estimated factors divided by the total number of data sets. And then also specifically for the community detection algorithms, the item placement accuracy, or the proportion, essentially the proportion of variables correctly placed into the true factor. So for the results, there's a lot to look at here. I have both continuous and polytomous data on the screen, but we'll just start by breaking down the continuous results here. So first, just looking at these blue bars, this is going to be our factor analysis, and this is our principal components analysis. And as you can see, these do very well, and if not, are performing some of the best just across the board here. And we do have a few algorithms that are performing well with the network data here. So we have the Louvain, the spin glass, walk trap, and the fast greedy. And these other algorithms really aren't performing too well here. So that's not a good sign for using those on your data. Flipping over to the polytomous data here, once again, just using the factor analysis and the PCA here, you can see that these accuracies have kind of gone down, at least relative to the community detection algorithms. And again, here we see some of the better performing ones. The Louvain, walk trap, and fast and greedy are among the best performing algorithms again. So just to quickly point out here, this pretty large magnitude of a difference between the continuous and polytomous data. The polytomous data, again, the 5-point Likert scale is very commonly used in psychology here. And so when using these methods, we're actually not getting as good of results when we're estimating factors. So these network community detection algorithms would probably be preferred. Because I heard the timer here, I know that my time is about up, so I'll just quickly kind of cover these results here. These are just the item placement for the top 3 community detection algorithms, the walk trap, Louvain, Fast, and Grady. I won't go over these results here just for the sake of time, but I do at least have a summary of what was found in this large graph here. Oops. So just as a summary, the Louvain and the walk trap algorithms performed as well as these traditional methods, and they outperformed them specifically with the polytomous data. And for item placement, actually, these factor loadings, when factor loadings were small, sample sizes small, or correlations between factors were large, the item placement was not as successful. All right, the big take home here, psychometric networks can estimate factors as well as principal components in factor analysis. They have some advantages over these methods that they should perhaps be preferred over them. And then finally, when using networks to estimate factors, the Louvain or walk trap algorithm should be preferred. At the end of my slides here, there's some resources. This talk is under review. And if you're interested in applying any of these methods and are familiar with R, the EGANet package is available on Crone. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for listening.
Great, Alex. So I'm going to read a question that's in the chat, which was polytomous data analyzed as polychoric? I don't know what that word means. Polychoric correlations, or did you assume they were continuous?
We use polychoric correlations. So yes, we did use polychoric correlations are assuming that there's a normal distribution underlying the splits in the ratings of 1 to 5 in this example. And yes, we use polychoric correlations.
So one thing Alex is going to be working on is on a grant that we just received from the Templeton Foundation, which is trying to understand a technical term from philosophy called aesthetic cognitivism, which is the basic proposition that aesthetic engagement with art enhances understanding. And so, as you can imagine, what aesthetic engagement actually means, what understanding means, these are all multi-dimensional, complicated constructs with all kinds of theoretical baggage, but that's where we will try to use some of these methods to disambiguate some of these issues, and hopefully we'll make some headway there. Okay, so we will have time to come back at the end as you're cogitating over this and other questions arise, and maybe in combination with some of the talks. So I'm going to now turn to Adam Weinberger, who got his PhD from Georgetown. He worked and continues to work with Adam Green, who some of you may know is currently the president of the Society for Neuroscience of Creativity. Adam, as a grad student, managed was successful in being a co-PI on a grant with also to the Templeton Foundation. And he is, one of the things that people who do empirical aesthetics are always a question that often comes up is, what is aesthetics good for, right? How do you, there's this desire to think of aesthetics as being intrinsically valuable and for its own sake. But when we make those claims, it's only other people who believe that actually sort of nod. And, so the question always for us is, how do we convince the unbelievers that aesthetics and aesthetic experiences are important? But one piece of that is thinking of how it applies in other contexts. And right now we're in the midst of writing an NSF grant, looking at not aesthetics per se, but related to aesthetics, but how this applies in educational settings. And so in that context, I think what Adam is going to talk about is, broadly saying, how do we take these constructs from neuroscience, from cognitive neuroscience, and how do they apply in a real world education setting? And so I will turn it over to you, Adam.
Okay, thank you, Anjan. Let me get this set up here. Okay, that looks correct, yes?
Yes.
Okay, welcome everyone again. So for today's talk, I'm gonna focus on results from an NSF-funded project examining neural and behavioral data from a group of high school students before and after their senior year. I should just say at the outset, like most large research projects, there are several questions from this data set that we're investigating. And what I'll be sharing today is just one such question. Maybe afterwards I can talk more broadly about the project. Okay, so it is now well established that the brain's functional network architecture facilitates learning, and recent efforts have sought to quantify and predict learning based on individual differences in network organization. Of particular note, a number of recent perspectives, many of which have been provided by labs at Penn, have highlighted the potential use of using network science to develop biomarkers or frameworks of learning that are descriptive of brain processes underlying learning and also correlated with future capacity to learn across possibly a wide range of learning domains and conditions. Somewhat surprisingly though, these questions have not yet been extended to real world or classroom-based learning. So this question, whether we can use individual differences in brain network organization to predict classroom learning and achievement, is the focus of what I'll be talking about today. Now, there are a lot of candidate organizational principles that could be used to ask these kinds of questions, but I was primarily interested in looking at modularity. So this will tie in nicely with Alex's talk, but just a brief background on kind of what I mean when I say modularity. So broadly speaking, a modular network is defined as one in which network nodes are clustered into multiple distinct subgraphs or communities. Nodes within a subgraph are densely connected and communicate frequently, and those in different subgraphs have sparser connectivity. So modularity therefore quantifies the extent to which a network exhibits this kind of segmentation. So the brain is considered to be one such modular network, with nodes in this case referring to specific brain regions and connectivity based on functional associations or functional connectivity. Prior work has indicated that modularity supports learning because these organizational principles provide the capacity to adaptively reorganize subgraphs in the presence of new information or experiences. So the idea here is that neuronal populations that are not specialized to respond to an input can remain detached from the learning process while the task relevant networks can reconfigure. So in this way, a modular network allows for new connections to form without necessarily disrupting old ones. In support of this line of thinking, a small but consistent collection of work has found that whole brain modularity is associated with intervention-based improvements in cognitive functioning, particularly for older adults and patient populations. So this kind of work uses whole brain modularity, which is obtained prior to the start of some sort of intervention, to try to predict individual differences in training gains. There's also some work to suggest that modularity may be a marker of general or fluid intelligence, but none of this work has extended these findings to classroom-based learning or achievement, which takes us to the current study. So in this study, participants were scanned before and after their senior year of high school. One thing that I have not yet mentioned is that half of the students in this study were enrolled in a specialized course designed to improve spatial reasoning abilities. So we can think of these students as like the intervention group, and comparing behavioral and neural changes in this group relative to controls, so the students that were not enrolled in the course, was one of the main objectives of this research project. But again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of focus on the modularity question. Suffice to say that the students enrolled in this specialized course showed significant improvements on the spatial reasoning measures that we had them complete from time 1 to time 2, while the controls did not show that level of improvement, so the intervention appeared to be successful. What is most important for the purposes of this talk, though, is to understand that when I'm referring to learning, I'm referring to the extent of this improvement from time point 1 to time point 2. Okay, so during the visit, participants completed a spatial reasoning task, which is related to the things they learned in the course, as well as a short resting scan. So the key questions here are thus, is modularity altered by task demands? So what I mean by this is, do we see differences in modularity during task and during rest? I also wanted to know if individual differences in modularity at time point 1 would be associated with differences in learning. So for this question, I focused only on the students that were enrolled in the specialized course, and like prior work, tried to use their modularity prior to the intervention to predict how much improvements they had in the course. And then my third question was whether modularity relates to academic achievement. So this is fairly straightforward, just looking at modularity as it associates with GPA. Okay, so moving on to the results. So the first question was asking about whether the modularity is altered by the task. And as indicated by this figure, the answer appears to be yes. So the resolution parameter, which is something I have along the x-axis here, is something that was used in the calculation of modularity to allow us to estimate communities of different sizes. But what's important to know is basically across all the different scales and sizes, the average modularity for the full sample at rest was higher than what we saw during task. This is consistent with prior work and seems to indicate that when completing a complex cognitive task, there may be some sort of departure from a more basal modular state. In other words, there's more communication between brain regions that may otherwise be more segregated. For the remainder of the analyses that I'll be presenting, I'm only going to be focusing on the modularity that was obtained during the reasoning task. This is for a few reasons. The resting scan was fairly short, so there's some questions about whether functional connectivity has stabilized. And also more practically, we didn't see anything with the resting data, so you can just kind of assume that there's a null result from the resting data to go along with everything else that I'm presenting. Okay, so our second question was asking if modularity was associated with learning. So we asked whether modularity scores at the first visit could be used to predict the extent of learning in the intervention group of students. Again, learning in this case refers to improvements in the spatial reasoning tasks that they completed in the scanner, as well as development of spatial habits of mind. So spatial habits of mind we assessed outside of the scanner with a questionnaire. And this basically assessed the tendencies of students to use spatial information while problem solving. And this is a direct measure of the kind of tendencies that were fostered by the course. So you can think of it as the extent to which students learn the course goals and objectives. And what we can see here is, although there's clear differences, individual differences in modularity, in contrast to our prediction, there's actually not a relationship between modularity prior to enrollment in the course and the amount of learning that those students had. So basically, modularity was not associated with changes in spatial reasoning or the development of spatial habits of mind. However, we did identify a really strong and striking correlation between whole brain modularity and GPA. So this analysis considered the full sample of participants, so people that were in the specialized course and those that were not. But this was also observed almost the same kind of relationship for just the students in the intervention group. So this plot here is simply the zero order correlation between modularity and GPA, but modularity remained a significant predictor of GPA in a fairly stringent linear regression model in which we controlled for demographic information in scanner motion, as well as other measures of functional connectivity. So while our findings seem to be inconsistent with work that is described in association between modularity and intervention-related gains, these findings do suggest a possible connection with academic achievement. Okay. So to summarize, we found that modularity was higher at rest than during the task, which suggests there may be some sort of reconfiguration of the network organization in the presence of task demands. We did not find that modularity was associated with learning in the intervention group of students, but we did find a strong correlation, which remained significant in a regression model between modularity and GPA. So together, these findings provide some novel insights into the network principles of brain organization that may or may not be relevant for classroom-based learning and achievement? There's a number of kind of open questions here, so I'm just gonna touch on a few of those very briefly. Again, happy to talk more about this later. So we found different associations between resting state modularity and task-based modularity as it relates to GPA. We didn't find a correlation between modularity at rest and with GPA. But we also saw that modularity was higher at rest. So is the positive association then that we observed between the task-based modularity and GPA related to something like effort? You could imagine perhaps that students with higher GPAs maybe don't need to work quite as hard, for kind of lack of a better word, when they were doing the spatial reasoning problems, and maybe then they're kind of more closely related to the state they had when they were at rest, which could manifest as a higher modularity. Modularity has also been previously tied to learning and intervention-related gains, and some work has associated modular organization with assessments of general intelligence and memory. So learning, intelligence, memory, all of these constructs are likely to be closely related, but there may be some sort of dissociation between comparatively shorter interventions, which would be like the course that the students took, and something more long-term, which would be their GPA, which was averaged over 3 years prior to enrollment. GPA, of course, is host to all kinds of additional factors, motivation, attendance, effort, all these things could be influencing GPA. So any combination of these and other variables could also be explaining the association we found. And finally, another important point to note is that the analyses I presented today are basically assuming a linear relationship between modularity and the dependent variables. But one could imagine that it's possible that maybe that isn't right. If you think of like a hypothetical case where someone would have an entirely unmodular brain with no overarching principles at all, and then kind of the other extreme where maybe there's a brain, I mean, these brains don't actually exist, but for a thought exercise, if there's a brain that's completely modular and absolutely no cross communication between the different communities, neither of those cases would probably be ideal. So we may be looking at something more of like there's a sweet spot between high and low, which would influence the analyses that we were doing. So thus, there's clearly far more work that's needed to kind of get at this nature and the utility of modularity as it pertains to learning, but this is what we had in this data set. So thank you.
Great. Terrific. So a couple of questions. One is, was brain size controlled for? It correlates about 0.40 with IQ. So it could be an important effect here.
Yeah, so that we have that data. We have sort of like structural data. I don't know if we necessarily have that available, but that's a good question. I should take a look at that. I mean, anytime you're talking about the functional connections, there's always the underlying structural connections, which are, you know, a big part of that, which ideally you'd be able to incorporate into your analyses. But that's a good question.
I think a similar question is interesting work. Was density strength of functional networks correlated with Q/included as a covariate?
Yeah, so that was something that we included as a covariate in the, I can go back here. So that was when I had said like lower level kind of network principles that are driving the modularity calculation but aren't inherently the thing we're asking. So density was included as a covariate, and I think there was a lot of these, because kind of all these different network features are part of the modularity question, there was an association between something like that and the GPA as well, which is why we wanted to control for it.
Have you looked into other network science measures, such as average shortest path length for quantifying interconnectivity between nodes or modules in the network?
Yes, so we've looked at that. I've looked at like centrality and kind of hubbiness of some of the nodes, specifically like the spatial network, which was relevant for the task. We've considered maybe the spatially involved brain regions maybe take on more of a central role. We didn't see anything with that question. We also have applied more like dynamic connectivity analyses, so thinking about things like flexibility and changes over the course in the scan, course of the time in the scan. And, you know, some of those are coming out, some of those aren't. modularity was kind of the one I thought, for the purposes of a 10-minute talk, was like the cleanest explanation. But yes, we've also considered a lot of other network measures, and I think probably, as you would expect, some seem to be consistent with this and some are giving up null results.
So let me ask one final, more general question. This whole question of how we think about the brain, the extent to which it's modular and the extent to which it's massively distributed, is a conversation that's been going on for 150 years, right? At the second half of the 19th century, among neurologists, this was a big topic, and people varied. And over the years, the metaphors by which people discuss this is influenced by the technology and the statistical methods available at the time, right? What the technological metaphors were. And what for me is cool about this is that this actually moves the conversation forward, not from whether the organization is modular versus distributed, to individual differences in degree of modularity and degree of distributedness, right? So for me, that feels like it's shifting the 150-year-old debate in a useful fashion. The one question I have is around GPA, which is, it's a very specific kind of measure. And thinking about ideas of fluid and crystalline intelligence, is it the case that, I'm just completely speculating, one could imagine modularity is good for crystalline intelligence and more distributed organization for fluid intelligence, and GPA maybe is measuring, you got to know the answer on your multiple choice, right? It's that kind of performance or achievement that's being looked at. Do you think there's anything to this idea that in this individual difference between degree of modularity and distributed nature, the kinds of achievements that one might have might vary depending on what your achievement-dependent measure is?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't know the authors off the top of my head, but I know there was a paper fairly recently that came out that basically asked that question, or at least trying to take like a shared, like one measure of, I don't know if it was modularity or something else, but one network-based measure of the brain, and see how it kind of differentially relates to different measures that we traditionally think of as like G. And I need to refresh myself on what the paper was, but the findings were along the lines of what you are suggesting, that it wasn't the same for kind of all these different domains. So yeah, and whether, more or less modularity varies based on the kind of intelligence that we might be talking about, I think it's very reasonable to think that that would be the case.
All right, great. Thanks, Adam.
Yep.
And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to James so we can all flourish.
Well, thank you, Anjan. Appreciate it. Alex and Adam, great job starting us off. Boy, each of you were able to say a lot in 10 minutes clearly. If we only all could aspire to such communication, we would be in good state. So the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project has been going formally, I guess, since our first grant in 2014. And if you think of human flourishing, it's a botanical metaphor from the flourishing of plants. When plants are blossoming, doing well, growing, and so forth. And it turns out that culture is also a botanical metaphor. So culture comes from the Latin word cultivate. So if you cultivate your land successfully, then the plants should flourish. So if we take those terms now and thinking about the human world, then if we're interested in human flourishing, then one way in which we might get to human flourishing is through culture. And when culture is experienced and created and developed and applied successfully, it should result in human flourishing of individuals, of groups, of society in general. So the way we define then the positive humanities is the humanities in general are defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as the branch of learning concerned with human culture. And so we define the positive humanities as the branch of learning concerned with human culture in its relation to human flourishing. Now, thinking about the connection between culture and human flourishing is probably not difficult. I'm sure that each one of us have our music lists, have our favorite movies, perhaps our favorite poetry, novels, works of art, and so forth. And we hopefully have time to turn to those and to rely on those for our own flourishing in our daily lives. It's important, though, to have more than just anecdotal evidence. How do we know when elements of culture result in flourishing, in what different kinds of ways? Well, as questions of assessment have arisen with the humanities and culture in general, they've largely focused initially on extrinsic, instrumental value. So what is the economic value of the movie industry or of the British museums, for example? They've also asked questions about vocational value. So if you major in the humanities, can you get a job? And if you do get a job, will you make as much as people who majored in physics or in engineering? They've also been the subject of measurement in the classroom, for example. So what is your grade? What is your GPA in taking these kinds of classes? Now, it's important to know the economic and the vocational and the academic outcomes and impacts of the humanities, but that's not why we have arts and culture in the first place, right? We have arts and culture in the first place because they have a eudaimonic connection to us. They're connected to our own flourishing, our own well-being. So the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project is interested in part in focusing on the assessment of the intrinsic benefits of participation, engagement in arts and culture. So things like personal enjoyment, flow states, other kinds of positive emotions, for example, individual and societal growth, so ways in which they can help us develop our identity as individuals or connect with other people or become more aware of opportunities for growth as a society, for example, in terms of equity and social justice. And then finally, in terms of meaning making. So how do we make sense of this world in which we live? What are the narratives that can help us to understand the world and our place in it? So these are just a few of many of the intrinsic benefits that might arise from engagement in arts and culture, arise from the positive humanities. So I'm delighted that today we get to hear from two of our team members talking about some of their research as it relates to the work of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. So first of all, we will hear from Damien Crone. Damien received his PhD from the University of Melbourne last year and working in the area of moral psychology. He also has significant training in neuroscience. We're delighted that he has been with us now for about the last year, a little over a year, I guess now, and is particularly working on data science approaches to questions in the domain of the humanities and human flourishing. So Damien, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, James. I'll just take a look to get my slides ready. So hopefully you can all see that. So what I'm presenting today is cross-cultural analyses of the well-being correlates of artistic interests, with the caveat that some of the analyses and interpretations you'll be seeing today are just a few hours old. So please bear with me. So I'll start with what are probably three very familiar perspectives on the arts and humanities and the public discourse that have motivated this research. And so those are that the arts and humanities are unequivocally good for well-being, that they're also not worth investing in, and also that they're a luxury for the privileged. Now, obviously, these three things can't all be true, so this is pretty much what motivated the study that I'm presenting to you here. So what we're asking is, are arts and humanities related interests or creative values or vocations consistently associated with metrics of well-being across cultures and across socio-demographic groups? So to address this question, we are using pre-existing data from the World Values Survey, specifically wave 6 of the survey, which is conducted between 2010 and 2014. And the analyses that we'll be going through involve between 22,000 and 86,000 participants from between 21 and 60 different nations. And so in this data set, there are 3 well-being related outcomes that we're interested in. So first of all, a measure of happiness, a measure of life satisfaction, and a measure of meaning in life. One caveat that I'll note about the meaning in life measure, so I have the question wording right there. You can see that this specific question is about how often people think about meaning as opposed to how much they experience the presence of meaning in their lives. So that's one caveat to keep in mind as I proceed. So those are the 3 outcomes we're interested in. We also have 3 broadly arts-related predictors that we're interested in examining. So there's an item from a Big 5 questionnaire where people rate the extent to which they have artistic interests. There's a measure of creative values and a measure of the extent to which people's work typically involve creative tasks. I mentioned we're interested in examining associations between these variables while taking into account various socio-demographic factors. So the factors that we're considering here are measures of class, people's satisfaction with their financial situation, their income, and their levels of education. So to analyze this data, we use multi-level models, which briefly basically allow you to take into account people and nations at the same time. So essentially that means individuals from the same nation are on average going to be more similar to each other than they will be to people from other nations. The analyses that we run allow us to take into account contextual variation in associations across nations. So for example, you could imagine creative values might be positively associated with happiness in one country, might be negatively associated in another country, and there might be no association at all in yet another country. These analyses also allow us to take into account interactions between the person and nation. So for example, we can ask, are people with creative values happier on average? Or are people in creative nations happier on average? Or are people with creative values in nations that tend to emphasize creative values happier on average? Or do all 3 of these things hold? So for those that are familiar with multi-level models, a few technical details. So for all of the variables, we estimated person and nation level effects and interactions between the 2. The one exception to this is the socio-demographic variable of class, because nation level class is not really a meaningful variable. Our analytic approach is pre-registered. We focus our interpretation on models that use the most complex random effect structure feasible. But also because we estimate a number of different kinds of models with the same associations, we do examine consistency across multiple models. So I'll just talk you through the way the results are going to be presented. So first of all, well, given that there are 3 outcomes and 3 predictors that we are interested in, that is more than I will be able to fit in the remaining 5 minutes that I have. So I'll just say that I'm going to focus on the association between creative values and our 3 outcomes of interest. So what you're looking at here is a multi-level model that is just predicting happiness from creative values at both the individual level, the nation level, and the interaction between the 2. And so you can see here is an unstandardized parameter estimate, which is positive and significant. So this suggests that the more an individual endorses creative values across, the more an individual endorses creative values, the greater happiness they report. And this is a consistent association across nations. These 3 models here are testing the same thing, but also including additional, the other 2 arts-related predictors, including the socio-demographic factors and including all variables at once. So the important thing to notice here is that that individual level positive association between creative values and happiness holds in all of these models. So to give you a little bit more of a concrete view of what that model suggests, I'm going to show you 4 different plots that correspond to those 4 different models, presenting the model's prediction for the association between creative values and happiness. So here we have just the model with creative values predicting happiness. And so each line corresponds to the estimated effect for either a nation with average level creative values, so that's the blue line in the middle, a nation that strongly endorses creative values, which is the green line, and a nation which has relatively lower endorsement of creative values. The important thing to see there is that the lines all will trend in the same direction. There's a positive association between creative values and happiness that doesn't seem to vary across countries. And this pattern broadly holds across the alternative models that include different sets of predictors. I mentioned that we tested a lot of different models, so as a sort of robustness check, we examine each parameter estimate from 40 or so models. So the points you're looking at here are each the individual level parameter estimate for the association between individual level creative values and happiness. And you can see that the parameter estimates are all positive and significant across the 40 or so models. And for the level 2 model, the level 2 parameter estimates and the cross-level interactions, they tend to be non-significant across all different models. So I've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'll very quickly run through the other 2 outcome variables. So the second outcome variable we had was satisfaction with life, and what you can see here is a very similar pattern. So creative values are positively associated with satisfaction with life for each of these 4 sets of models. Only at the individual level, we don't seem to observe any such effects at the nation level or any interaction between the 2. So once again, these are just the plots of the model predictions. You can see fairly consistent effects across all different models, across nations varying in their endorsement of creative values. Once again, the parameter estimates are fairly consistent across all the different models. Finally, looking at the association between endorsement of creative values and time spent thinking about meaning in life. Once again, we have a very similar pattern, positive significant effects for creative values. One thing worth noting here is that we have a positive cross-level interaction, but this only holds for one of the 4 models that I'm presenting, so perhaps best not to read too much into this. In terms of the way that plays out in the model predictions, you can see that it suggests that this interaction effect would suggest that people in nations that tend to emphasize creative values tend to experience a greater benefit in terms of thinking about meaning in life compared to nations that endorse creative values relatively less. Again, these parameter estimates are fairly consistent across the different models. I don't have a lot of time to go through the other analyses, but there are a couple of things that might be worth taking up in the discussion. But I will note that, so there is so we did pre-register our analysis plan, but we ran into one unanticipated limitation here, which was substantial missingness for one of the variables that we were going to focus our analyses on. So the artistic interest variable turned out to only have data available in 22 out of the 60 nations. So for any variable that, for any model that included artistic interests as a predictor, that limited our analyses to only 22 out of the 60 nations, leaving us with about a third or a quarter of the data we were expecting to have. But just to summarize, what we find at the individual level is a consistent pattern of positive associations between creative values and the 3 indicators of well-being. Less clear are the results for artistic interests and creative work. As I mentioned, the analyses of the nation-level effects and cross-level interactions are somewhat more complicated than we had hoped, but that's something that we're looking into at the moment. In terms of future steps, we are planning on looking at interactions between some of these different predictors. So, for example, looking at how these arts-related variables might interact with demographic factors such as income. And we've also started looking into other data sets that might be able to sort of corroborate some of the analyses that we've run here. But that's basically it. So thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Damien. Appreciate that. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to add them to the chat. Damien, one question, can you just remind us what the happiness factor was? What were they looking at in particular? How did they define happiness?
So it was just people rating, I think it was the, how often, let me just get the question up. So the question is, taking all things together, would you say you are, as 1 to 4 scale, not at all happy to happy?
Okay. Great, thank you. So we have a couple of questions coming in through the chat. First of all, from Sydney, were there items assessing consumption of the arts, or were arts-related predictors mainly about creative production?
Unfortunately, there weren't items in this particular survey about consumption of the arts. There were a couple of things that were sort of in the ballpark. So I think there was an item asking people if they were members of certain kinds of organizations, and I think artistic organizations might have been included in one of the questions, but that was sort of lumped in with other things. So it might have been like, are you a member of artistic or educational organizations, in which case that's sort of confounded with membership of educational organizations. So in short, there wasn't really a great question that could get at consumption of the arts in this data set. I think when I was poking around looking at other publicly available data sets, there might have been 1 or 2 that I came across that might have questions that can address those. So hopefully that's something that we'll be able to look into in the future.
Great. Alex wants to know if you have any thoughts on the mechanisms of why creative values is coming through for these positive well-being outcomes.
That is a good question, and it's not one that I have thought up a good answer for yet. Yeah, I'm not sure. So in some discussion that James and I had, we were sort of speculating on whether we might observe these effects in specific contexts where sort of creativity is more valued and conformity relatively less valued. But if such were the case, we might expect to find more variation across nations and less of a sort of consistent individual level effect across nations. But yeah, this is something that we'll be thinking about as we sort of clarify the interpretation of these results.
So ask us your question again in a few months, Alex, and we'll have a really good answer by then. Good, great question, thank you. And Anjan is interested to know, in addition to income, do you think relative income inequality across nations plays a role?
So, Anjan, are you talking about within country income inequality or between countries?
Between. So
Okay.
wondering whether, if 2 countries have the same mean income, but one country has widely dispersed, the upper and lower groups are much more widely dispersed. So you could imagine the US versus Scandinavian countries, right? Like this.
Yeah. I would, well, so I'm not sure how that would, I don't have a solid idea of how that might affect the association between the artistic or creativity related variables and well-being. I imagine lower income inequality would attenuate the associations between like any sort of individual level demographic factors. So, if you're living in a very equal, like a country with very equal income distributions, it probably doesn't matter much where you are in the sort of income hierarchy in terms of the association between these variables and well-being.
Great, thank you, Damien. Appreciate that. We will now turn to our final speaker of this session. So Katherine Cotter has completed her PhD also at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, also working with Dr. Paul Sylvia. She completed a dissertation on mental control of musical imagery, combining behavioral and experience sampling approaches. And indeed, she is specializing in experience sampling approaches, using them in a variety of contexts relevant to the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. I believe today she's going to talk to us about some of the work that she's been doing in a museum context, which is work that she will also be continuing in her time here at Penn as well. So Katherine, welcome.
Hi, thanks, James. All right, let's get that set up. Okay. Is it showing up correctly?
It is, yep.
Okay, perfect. I can never tell with these things. Yes, so thank you, James, for the introduction. I'll be presenting some work that I did prior to coming to Penn in collaboration with some folks at the University of Vienna. So I have to give them a shout out. So Matthew Pawelski, Ava Specker, and Anna Fekete were part of this project, and we're kind of in the process of getting this and another piece of the project written up for journals. And so I'll be talking about how we can think about the effects of art museum visitation through using a daily diary framework. And so oftentimes when we approach thinking about visiting an art museum, it can feel very ephemeral and intangible. And so in terms of research approaches, often we've taken usually one of two slants. So either the motivations, so what brings people to the museum, why are they there, what are they hoping to get out of it, as well as the outcome. So what do people actually take away from these experiences? And so on the motivation end, we may be thinking, okay, are people there to learn? Is it just something, I'm in Paris, and so you're supposed to do the Louvre while you're in Paris? Is it just something to get your selfie with the famous artwork to prove that you had that experience? Or perhaps you're there to relax and recharge because the museum really provides a certain ambiance or a certain kind of mental headspace for you. Or perhaps you're just dragged along because somebody else on your trip wants to go and you're there not to annoy them. On the other side of things, we can also think about, well, what are people actually taking away from these experiences? What are they getting out of them? And oftentimes when we think about this, some of the classic outcomes people are interested in are what emotional experiences are people having? Are they having positive emotional experiences, negative emotional experiences, mixed emotions? Are they satisfied with what they had during their visit, and how long did they stay? Did they like what they were seeing? Did they prefer the type of artworks they were looking at? And more recently, are there health and well-being benefits or outcomes relating to health and well-being that people take away from this? And so something that the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project is interested in, this project kind of ties in nicely with, is if we think about outcomes that are related to health and well-being, there's become this increasing interest in how can we leverage these outcomes and knowledge that there could be these benefits into becoming motivators for going to the museum. So going to the museum with the purpose of improving your health and well-being. Similarly to how you may start exercising or altering your diet with the goal of increasing your health and well-being. It can be a motivator, not just an outcome of a behavior. And so if we think about the realm of art museums, health and well-being, there have been a number of government and private agency and foundation reports in the past 20 years or so, really examining, well, what can the arts give us in terms of health and well-being? Can they benefit us in some manner? Can these processes, these experiences be beneficial to us? And one such thing that's become more and more popular is this idea of social prescribing. And so Museums on Prescription is a project in a few years old in the UK that was started to look at the benefits to older adults through a program of arts engagement in museum. And more contemporarily and more widespread now is the idea of arts on prescription that show health and well-being benefits and also a return on social investment. And so in these programs, essentially you go to your doctor, your general practitioner, and they can say, okay, my prescription for you is to go engage in the arts and go to the museum, and that will help alleviate some of your symptoms in theory. And so this is like a new realm of research that hasn't gotten as much empirical work, but there has been some empirical work looking at really like specialized groups. So looking at the benefits for dementia patients, how we can see mood and self-esteem improvements in veterans, and reduction in social isolation and increases in well-being in older adults through these art museum engagement experiences. However, a lot of this work really uses a reduction of the bad model. So for example, how can we really reduce depression symptoms rather than a flourishing model? So how can we promote the good? And so therefore, most work has focused on clinical or at-risk populations. Can we benefit these specific populations? And so an open question is, are there benefits for museum visits for non-clinical or non-at-risk populations? So in a normative sample, are there benefits? Are they similar benefits to what we may see in clinical populations? And can we leverage these experiences to just generally being a good kind of healthy experience? And so for this project, we collaborated with the Dome Museum in Vienna. And they had curated this really interesting exhibit called Show Me Your Wound. And it was really curated to promote reflection, empathy, and understanding of immigrant and refugee populations. And it contained a combination of historical Christian art from the Stephansdom Cathedral collection, as well as contemporary artworks, some of which were commissioned for this particular exhibit. And so the museum was hoping that through experiencing and viewing this collection of art, that people would reflect more upon their own experiences, would have a greater capacity for empathy, and would begin to kind of take perspectives of others and kind of recognize that their experience is not universal. And so we wanted to see, related to this, can we see some shifts in these types of well-being and health-related outcomes? And so we had a sample of psychology students who participated in 2 weeks of daily diaries. And so basically each evening for a week before their museum visit, they completed a diary on a set of questions, so a questionnaire diary. They visited the museum, completed a questionnaire that evening, and then for a week subsequent to their visit to this particular exhibit. So we could kind of get a baseline of what these variables look like before they visited the museum, that day of the visit, did anything change, as well as how long did any changes last for, if they did. And so the surveys were quite long, but I'm just going to focus on 3 kind of dimensions for the purposes of this talk. And so we asked them about their emotions, so to what extent they felt a number of emotions on that given day. Their quality of life, so how satisfied they were across a number of different dimensions of their life. So overall life satisfaction, satisfaction with their family relationship with significant others, so both romantic and platonic relationships, as well as their ability to help others. And finally, because the museum was most interested in empathy, how well they felt they were able to kind of take empathetic perspectives on that day. All right, so just got a couple minutes left to get you through the results. And so first, I'll talk about the daily emotional reports. And so here will be kind of the baseline. So what did people look like before they visited the museum? Were there any changes on the day of the museum visit? So in that evening, were there shifts in their emotional experiences, as well as did any changes or shifts last a day beyond the visit? So in the short term, did anything happen and did it last at all? And so first we see that for jealousy, people were less jealous than they were the week prior on the day that they visited the museum, but that difference dissipated a day later. So that jealousy effect did not last. People showed no changes in how grateful they were feeling, how content they were, how guilty they felt, or how stressed they were. So not a whole lot of differences in their emotional experiences as a result of this initial visit. We can also think about this in a longer time scale. So because people also completed these surveys for a full week after their visit, we can also see how the week before compared to the week after their visit. And so here we see no effects for jealousy, so there are no differences in jealousy, feeling grateful, feeling content, feeling guilty, or stressed. So basically, this museum visit did not shift their daily emotional routine. They were still pretty much the same before and after that visit. If we think about their quality of life, so again, this was how satisfied they were with these different domains of their life. Again, the week before the visit, the day of the visit, as well as the day following the visit. We can see people's satisfaction with their life overall increased the day of the visit and did not significantly decrease the day after. So it seems like that peak held for at least one day. Similarly, people were more satisfied with their family relationships on the day of the visit. And again, that did not dissipate immediately the day after. For their satisfaction with their significant others, again, increased the day of the visit and unfortunately decreased the day after. And interestingly, there was no changes in their satisfaction with their ability to help others the day of the visit or immediately after. If we think in terms of the longer time scale, there was no change overall in their overall life satisfaction, satisfaction with family relationships, with their significant other, but we did see a slight uptick in their satisfaction with their ability to help others. Finally, with empathy, there were no changes at all in people's reported ability to take the perspectives of others. They did feel more concerned for the less fortunate the day of the visit, but this again decreased the day following the museum visit. And they were also able to report feeling what others do more strongly the day of the visit, but again, this dissipated the day after the visit. If we look in a longer time scale, again, taking others' perspective showed no change in the longer scale, as well as concern for less fortunate or feeling what others do. So in terms of takeaways, it looked like for people's daily emotional reports, there wasn't that much change in emotion. So although people had emotional experiences in the museum, it didn't seem to shift their daily emotional tenor. In terms of quality of life, it does show that some aspects of quality of life did shift, but generally these shifts were only short term. Their satisfaction with their ability to help others was the only one that might have shown longer effects, but it's important to note we didn't actually measure helping behavior, just their satisfaction with their ability to help others. And finally, with empathy, this showed the largest day of effects or day of visit effects, but these also quickly dissipated the day after and didn't show any sustained change. So generally, this may suggest that our engagement can promote changes in well-being, at least in the short term. And so in the future work, we should look at dosage effects. So this was just one exhibit. So if it was a longer experience, would this have looked any different? As well as the effects of multiple visits. But this does show some initial evidence that we may be able to target specific aspects of well-being through an art visit to change some of these factors. All right, thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Katherine. Fascinating study. I think it would be nice if all of us were able to go through the exhibit at the Stephansdom and to get the full effect of what your research was.
Yeah.
So a few questions that are coming in through the chat.
Sure.
First of all, Tan wants to know why were these particular emotions picked in the study?
So we actually measured about 20 different emotions at the daily diaries. This was just a small subset for this particular presentation. So as part of our collaboration with the museum, they identified some particular emotions that they were most interested in conveying, as well as I kind of went through the list for the purposes of this presentation to find some that kind of resonated kind of across the board of the type of emotions that we measured in terms of positive and negative affectivity, as well as ones that were a little bit more relevant to the contents of the exhibit.
Cool. Sydney wants to know, was liking/enjoyment of the exhibit itself assessed?
It has not yet been analyzed.
Okay.
Yeah, so the broader scale of this, people were in the lab before they went to the museum. They did a lengthy survey immediately after the museum visit. They did a couple follow-up surveys. Here I'm just looking at the daily life kind of component. So it's a larger scale study that, like Adam mentioned, you have to kind of pare down for a 10-minute presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Great. So I'll ask one final question, and then we'll have just a few minutes for general discussion. So anybody who would like to chime in with general questions, feel free to do so in our final few minutes. Actually, Anjan just had another question as well for you, Katherine. Were their visits curated? So how long before which artworks they visited and all that kind of stuff?
No, so they were just asked to visit the museum within the span of a certain number of days, depending on when they were enrolled in the study. And then they went independently to the museum and then were just taken to that particular exhibition room so that they were only viewing that particular exhibit. But their behavior in the exhibit was entirely their own. They could stay for 5 minutes, they could stay for 5 hours. If they wanted to ask docent questions, they could, but none of that was restricted.
Cool. So Katherine, at the beginning of your talk, you distinguished between intentions and outcomes, which I think was really important. I seem to recall that the intentions that you were looking at there perhaps were mostly on the part of the visitors, although I could have that wrong. I'm curious if you could say more about what you just alluded to at the very end about how we might take these outcomes and build on them for longer lasting shifts and changes. So I'm thinking particularly about the intentions from the standpoint of the institution, of the museum itself. So my understanding is that you took an exhibit which had certain intentions around immigrants and so forth, but it would be interesting, right? Maybe I'll just ask my question the following way. What do you think could be done? Let's say that you reported this to the curators and they had a chance to reconfigure their exhibit in some way to try to optimize the outcomes that they were looking for in light of your evidence. What couple things might you suggest that they might do to get greater outcomes?
Sure. So I think for this particular exhibit, they were really, really pushing the empathy and understanding piece. And that's where we saw those largest immediate effects. They didn't last, but they were the largest effects that we did see. So the largest changes we were seeing. So I think part of it is just identifying the outcome that you want. So I think a lot of times there are these kind of general outcomes that we hope. We hope people are satisfied with their visit, feel more relaxed after their visit, and are just hoping for that more generally. And so I think something institutions could do is even on like an exhibit level is focus on, well, we hope this room will convey something like empathy or will convey something like relaxation. I know in the COVID times, a lot of museums are rethinking to have like a relaxation or like a de-stress type of room. And so there are a lot of things that can be done to do this. It can be having a specific type of tour that goes through that room that people can engage in, or a workshop to really hone in on some other mechanisms or other properties that would further that cause towards a particular outcome. But I think the important piece is to clearly identify a specific outcome that's of interest rather than perhaps these broader ones that I think are tending to be more of the norm. Is we hope people will relax and enjoy it. But those are pretty broad in general.
Yeah, cool. Great. So again, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I see Tan has one more question for you, Katherine, which I think is really connected to a question that was posed of Damien around mechanisms. So one of the mechanisms that we've hypothesized and that has emerged so far from our literature reviews and our work of various sorts is that immersion seems to be an important mechanism. And it makes sense, because if you're not paying attention, it's like unlikely that you're going to be changed in some way, right? And so do you think, Katherine, that further information about the artwork itself could be a way of helping people to get inside that work? Maybe learning more about the artist, learning more about the motivations and so forth, just any kind of way that you can get further attention, further focus, further immersion may perhaps open up a window for longer term outcomes, longer lasting outcomes.
Yeah, I think just what you're saying is giving particular information can be very helpful, because I can just think of some different museums I've been to, or even within the same room of artwork. Some have really lengthy descriptive text, and some are just, here's the artist, the year it was made, and the materials. And so when you hear the story of the particular artist or their inspiration for a particular artwork, it gives you a new perspective on that piece. And so something else museums can always consider is through apps or audio tours or other technology, is having those geared towards, okay, you want to relax, here's like the relax tour, and it gives you extra information about different things. And so, or there's like the immersion tour. I know there's some really great workshops on like the art of looking, and so how to really deeply and meaningfully like view an artwork rather than kind of the skimming we tend to do. So I think some really great work by Jeff and Lisa Smith is something like 20 seconds per artwork is like the norm. And if you're there over a minute, it's like very unusual and very weird. So if we think about like immersion as a mechanism, people aren't generally being so immersed in a museum. They're just kind of skimming, be like, okay, that looked nice, and then keep going. So
yeah. Cool, thank you, Katherine. I see that we're approaching the end of our time, so I'll just say a few things, and then Anjan, I'll turn it over to you for the last word. First of all, just thank you to each of the presenters. What a really fascinating time here. So please join me in thanking them. This is the virtual version of thunderous applause. So just so you know how much we appreciated your work. It's great to see that people with this kind of expertise and experience and perspective are coming into the Penn context, and really looking forward to hopefully Anjan will be able to do this on somewhat of a regular basis and find out, and hear about what the work is that you have done specifically oriented towards the work at the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics or the Humanities and the Flourishing Project, given these domains of expertise. And of course, we're also looking for ways in which we can bring our areas of interest together. I know I see Vera Ludwig is also here. Vera, nice to see you, from Michael Platt's lab. And so we're really interested in expanding both the information exchange, but also the possibilities for collaboration during your time here. So welcome to Penn. Thank you for the great presentation, and we're really looking forward to the continued collaboration. So with that, Anjan, over to you.
I don't really have that much to add. I want to thank the speakers again for being so concise and communicating the information, which is great. It's probably because you guys aren't full professors, because they can never shut up. I do want to make just one point for trainees and students, and this certainly applies to neuroaesthetics, and I suspect applies to positive psychology and human flourishing, which is what I tell often in my talks, I tell students is that these are such early fields that the big questions, the low-hanging fruit, are still just out there waiting to be plucked. Like these are not fields you go into and you're sort of debating minutia. So it makes it really a pretty exciting place to be as my pitch for these fields in general. So, and I'll leave it at that.
Terrific. Well, thanks, Anjan. I want to say a huge thank you to Sarah Sidoti as well, who helped to organize this. Again, thanks to all the presenters, and thanks to you, the participants who came and joined us. It would have been fairly awkward had we had an empty virtual room. So thank you for being here. We look forward to much more, and take care, be well, take care of that brain you have, and get some connection to culture and some human flourishing at some point this week. All right, take care, everybody. Be well. Thank you.